The wind cut through the kitchen window like a knife that winter of 1933. A mother in Toledo stared at 4 pennies on the table. 4 pennies, 3 children at her feet, and a Kroger receipt from the week before showing she had bought enough to feed them for 9 days straight. Not ramen, not stale bread, real food, hot meals, some nights even a small dessert. She knew something. Something her own mother had taught her in the kitchens of the old country. Something passed quiet between women who had outlived famines the history books barely mention. 9 items, under $4 in today's money. A way of stretching a grocery bag into a pantry that almost no American family remembers how to do anymore. I am going to walk you through every one of those 9 items before this is over. And I am going to show you a 1,936 United States Department of Agriculture Bulletin, number 1,757, that quietly listed the exact ratios that made it work. It still works. Your nearest Kroger still sells every one of these items. The price tags will surprise you more than anything. My grandmother kept a tin box on top of her ice box. Inside that box, she kept little squares of waxed paper folded around dried things, and she would not let any of us grandkids touch it. I thought she was being stingy. I was 8 years old and I had no idea I was looking at a survival system older than the Republic. It took me 40 years and a lot of wasted grocery money to understand what was in that tin. Let me take you back to that Toledo kitchen. The husband had been laid off from the Willys Overland plant in the spring. By November, the savings were gone. The neighbors were in worse shape. The breadlines downtown stretched 4 blocks, and the woman, her name lost to time, but her recipes preserved in a community cookbook published by a Lutheran church in 1939, refused to stand in one. She had her 4 pennies, and she had her knowledge. The first item she bought was a 5-pound sack of pinto beans. In 1933, that ran about 19 cents. Today at Kroger, that same 5-pound sack runs between $4 and $6, depending on the week. But a 1-pound bag, which is what most folks actually need, sits right around $1.29. 1 pound of dry pintos, properly soaked and cooked, yields almost 7 cups of finished beans. 7 cups. That alone is 14 side servings or 7 main course bowls. The USDA bulletin I mentioned put the protein yield of 1 pound of dried beans at roughly equal to 2.5 pounds of fresh beef, at a fraction of the cost. Even then, even now. But beans alone will run a family into the ground. Anyone who has tried to live on them knows what I mean. Within a week, the children stop eating. The body starts rejecting them. The old folks knew this, which is why the second item in her basket mattered so much. Cornmeal. Plain yellow cornmeal, the kind that comes in the paper sack with the picture of the mill on the front. At Kroger today, that 2-pound sack is about $1.50. In 1933, it was 8 cents. She bought it because cornmeal and beans together form what nutritionists a generation later would call a complete protein. The amino acids the beans lack, the corn provides. The amino acids the corn lacks, the beans provide. Mexican grandmothers knew this for 3,000 years before any laboratory confirmed it. She would make a thin cornbread in a cast iron skillet, crumble it into the bean pot, and feed 5 people for under a dime. Now here is where most folks today get stuck. They hear beans and cornbread and they picture a sad brown meal eaten in silence. That is not what this woman served. She served something her family actually looked forward to, and the reason was the third item in her basket. A single yellow onion, 3 cents in 1933, 69 cents today, sometimes less. 1 onion, sliced thin and cooked slow in a dry skillet until the edges turn dark brown, releases a sweetness that transforms a bean pot into something a restaurant would charge $12 for. The old cooks called it the poor man's seasoning. It was the bridge between starvation, food, and supper. The fourth item was a head of green cabbage. In 1933, 4 cents. At Kroger this week, a small head runs about $1.20. Cabbage was the secret weapon of every Depression kitchen north of the Mason-Dixon line. Cheap, filling, loaded with vitamin C, which mattered enormously in winter when fresh produce vanished from the shelves. She would shred half of it raw with a splash of vinegar for a slaw and cook the other half down with the onion to bulk out the bean pot. 1 head fed her family across 3 different meals. The 5th item was where her mother's knowledge really started to show. She bought a 1-pound bag of long-grain white rice. Today at Kroger, store brand, about $1.10. In 1933, 7 cents. White rice keeps for 30 years if you store it dry. Brown rice goes rancid in 6 months because of the oils in the bran. The Depression generation chose white rice on purpose, and the modern health magazines that told everyone brown was better never mentioned that small detail. 1 pound of dry rice yields about 10 cups cooked. Combined with beans, it forms the same complete protein the cornmeal does. She rotated, rice one night, cornbread the next. The children never got tired because the flavors changed. So that is 5 items, and we are at maybe $4 and change in modern Kroger money. But the meal is still missing something. It is missing fat. And without fat, the body cannot absorb the vitamins, the brain stops working right, and children get cranky and sick. Here is where the story turns, because what she bought next is the item that has nearly disappeared from American kitchens. And the reason it disappeared is not an accident. The 6th item was a small tub of lard, pure rendered pork fat. In 1933, it was 9 cents a pound. At Kroger today, in the baking aisle on the bottom shelf where they hide it, a 1-pound tub of Armour lard runs about $3 and change, but you only need a spoonful at a time, so that tub lasts a household 2 months easy. 1 tablespoon in the bean pot, 1 tablespoon to fry the cornbread, 1 smear on the cast iron before the onions hit it. Lard was the foundation of American cooking from the Pilgrims until about 1911. That year, a company called Procter & Gamble launched a product called Crisco, made from cottonseed oil, which up to that point had been considered industrial waste used for soap and lamp fuel. They could not sell it as food because nobody wanted it. So they hired a marketing firm, ran a 15-year campaign telling American housewives that lard was dirty and old-fashioned, gave away free cookbooks with every can, and by the late 1940s they had replaced a fat humans had eaten for 10,000 years with one extracted by hexane from a fiber crop. The Depression mothers who kept using lard, who refused to switch, fed their families better food at a fraction of the cost. The science finally caught up in the 2000s when researchers admitted the seed oils were the problem all along. The grandmothers were right. They were always right. That is the villain, and it is just one of them. There are more before we get to the finale. The 7th item in her basket was a dozen eggs. In 1933, about 20 cents. At Kroger this week, store brand large, around $2 and change. Sometimes $1.90 on sale. 1 egg cracked into hot cornbread batter makes it rise. 1 egg beaten into rice with a little onion makes a meal. 1 egg per person per week was enough to fill the protein gaps the beans and cornmeal could not. She kept the eggs in a bowl on the counter, not in the icebox. Fresh eggs have a natural coating called the bloom that keeps them shelf stable for weeks at room temperature. American producers wash that bloom off, which is why we have to refrigerate them. In most of Europe to this day, eggs sit on the shelf next to the bread. The 8th item was a small sack of oats, plain rolled oats, not the flavored packets. In 1933, 6 cents a pound. At Kroger today, the 18-ounce canister of Kroger brand oats runs about $2.40, but a 42-ounce canister is around $4, and that is where the real value is. Oats for breakfast with a spoon of lard and a pinch of salt. Oats stretched into the bread. Oats fed to the chickens if you had them, which converted to more eggs, which converted to more meals. The 9th and final item is the one I want you to pay closest attention to, because it is the cheapest of all, and it is the one nobody buys anymore. A box of plain iodized table salt, 26 ounces, 68 cents at Kroger today. In 1933, it was about 3 cents. Salt was not just for flavor. Salt was the entire preservation system of a Depression kitchen. She would salt cure cabbage into sauerkraut in a stoneware crock, and that crock would feed her family fermented vegetables loaded with vitamin C and live probiotics for 4 months through the winter. She would brine eggs in salt water and they would keep for a year on the shelf. She would rub salt into any scrap of meat that came her way, and it would not spoil before she could use it. One 68-cent box of salt, used the way her mother taught her, replaced an entire refrigerator and an entire freezer and most of a pharmacy. Now, I promised you a way to do this in an apartment. You do not need a stoneware crock. You do not need a basement. You do not need a homestead. You need a wide-mouth quart mason jar, which is $2.50 at any hardware store, and you need that box of salt and that head of cabbage. Shred the cabbage fine. Sprinkle 1.5 tablespoons of salt over 2 pounds of shredded cabbage. Massage it with your hands for 10 minutes until it releases its own water. Pack it tight into the jar so the liquid covers the cabbage completely. Lay a smaller jar or a clean rock on top to keep it submerged. Cover with a cloth. Leave it on your kitchen counter for 7 to 14 days. That is sauerkraut. That is the same probiotic miracle they sell at Whole Foods for $9 a jar. You just made it for about $1.50. It will keep in your refrigerator for 6 months once it tastes the way you like it. 1 forkful with a bowl of beans and rice, and you have replaced an entire shelf of vitamins. I told you there was a finale, something obscure, something even most preppers do not know. I went back to that USDA Bulletin 1757, the one from 1936, and I found a line item near the back that I had to read 3 times before I believed it. The bulletin recorded that families who combined dry beans, cornmeal, and a fermented vegetable like sauerkraut in the same meal absorbed nearly 40% more iron from the beans than families who ate the beans alone. The acid from the fermented cabbage broke down the phytic acid in the beans, the compound that normally blocks iron absorption. The grandmothers did not know the chemistry, they knew the result. Children who got the kraut with their beans did not get the listless gray look that came with anemia. Children who got the beans plain did. So every depression mother who put a fork of kraut on the plate next to the bean bowl was performing a nutritional trick that modern medicine did not figure out until 1981, when a paper out of Cornell University finally confirmed what the immigrant kitchens of Toledo and Pittsburgh and Milwaukee had been doing for 100 years. That is the finale. That is the secret. Beans, cornmeal, and a forkful of homemade kraut on the same plate. 3 items together for under $3 at Kroger, feeding a family of 4 a meal that delivers more usable nutrition than a $30 steak dinner. The seed oil companies could not sell you that. The supplement industry could not patent it. The cereal makers could not put it in a box, so it was allowed to be forgotten. But it was never gone. It was sitting in a paper bulletin in the National Agricultural Library. It was sitting in a Lutheran church cookbook from 1939. It was sitting in my grandmother's tin box on top of the icebox. And now it is sitting with you. You did not just hear 9 grocery items. You recovered the operating manual your great-grandmother used to keep her children alive through the worst economic collapse this country ever saw. That knowledge belongs to you. It was always yours. Somebody just hoped you would forget. You are the kind of person who still believes a kitchen should feed a family, not enrich a shareholder. That is why this matters to you. That is why you stayed to the end while everyone else scrolled past. Now I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me which of the 9 items your own grandmother or grandfather kept in the house. Was it the lard tub on the back of the stove, the sack of cornmeal in the pantry, the crock of kraut in the cellar? Tell me the one you remember. Tell me the kitchen it sat in. I read every single comment on these videos, and the stories you share become the seeds of the next ones. If you want to keep recovering what was taken from your family, the bell and the subscribe button are how you find your way back to this corner of the internet. There are more of us than the algorithm wants you to know. Next time I am going to show you the 3 things the Depression generation did with a single chicken that fed a family for 11 days, including the part that modern Americans throw straight in the trash that contains more usable protein than the breast meat. You will not believe what they did with the feet. Until then, keep the tin box on top of the icebox. Somebody in your family is going to need what is inside it.